Okay, good afternoon. Welcome everybody to the IPA Power Hour webinar on navigating the energy transition. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Brian Hepner, the Communications Associate with the IPA, and I'll be hosting this presentation today. To get started, let's go over some housekeeping items. To reduce any background noise, all participants are muted upon entry. Please feel free to submit questions at any time during the webinar. We will reserve some time towards the end of the presentation to address these questions. To submit, please use the chat feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. Today's session is being recorded, and a recording will be available on the IPA website under About Us/events. A couple of points I want to emphasize. This webinar is for general education purposes only and does not represent a legal interpretation or statement of policy by the IPA or its staff. During the webinar, speakers will discuss current issues with the energy grid and look at best practices to help the grid transition to clean energy. The discussion will also shed light on notable national and local policies that are aimed at transitioning Illinois to a clean energy future. After our Q&A portion, we will be joined by Acting Director of the Illinois Power Agency, Brian Granahan, for some closing remarks. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers for this session. They are Dr. Emily Grubert, Associate Professor with the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Grubert is a civil engineer and environmental sociologist. Stephen Bennett, Manager of Regulatory and Legislative Affairs and State Government Policy at PJM Interconnection. Stephen is the PJM liaison for Illinois, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Scott Vaught, Vice President of Strategy and Energy Policy at ComEd. Scott is responsible for evaluating and developing regulatory, legislative, and business strategies. Hannah McCory, Illinois Power Agency Fellow. Having joined the agency in May 2022, Hannah provides support on power procurement and RPS-related work, as well as other communications efforts. Hannah worked as a graduate research assistant at the Institute for Regulatory Policy Studies at Illinois State University. For those unfamiliar with the IPA or with Power Hour, this slide gives you an overview on the agency and its responsibilities, which include development and implementation of electricity procurement plans and solar incentive programs, as well as implementation of the Illinois Renewable Portfolio Standard. Now I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Emily Grubert, who will provide a broader overview on energy challenges that the U.S. is facing in the mid-clean energy transition period. Doctor?
Thank you, and nice to see everybody here. Thanks for spending part of your Friday afternoon with me. I was going to kick us off talking a little bit about, like was just said, navigating the energy transition and the grid challenges, and particularly from the perspective of having two different systems interacting with each other for potentially decades as we see movement from a more fossil-based system to a cleaner system. We can go to the next slide, please. The next one, I guess. Sorry, multiple covers. So one thing that I want to start us with, just to kind of anchor on what I think is a really important thing to be considering as we move through this energy transition, is that deep decarbonization is two things at some level, because we're not starting from scratch. It's industrialization, which is building out this big new clean system, but it's also deindustrialization. And in that sense, what I'm talking about is really that we have a lot of existing infrastructure that is aging and is potentially not compatible with a fully decarbonized future. And so these are two different processes. We talk a lot about industrialization and particularly the benefits of that process. So creating new industries, creating new jobs, those types of things, and really thinking about what it actually looks like to build out a clean energy system. Similarly, we talk a lot about the benefits of decarbonization. So this is not just mitigating climate change, but also a lot of co-benefits potentially, like, reduced water use and reduced co-pollutants, air emissions, those types of things. What we don't really talk very much about are some of the disbenefits of industrialization. I think this conversation is getting a bit bigger just because people are really starting to think a lot more about siting and habitat infringement, things like that. We don't tend to talk very much at all about deindustrialization in very explicit terms. I think people talk a lot about the potential for job losses that are regionally anchored, things like that, but we don't really talk about it in a very specific, planned, and explicit way very often. And specifically, we don't really talk about how we manage what I've been calling the mid-transition, which is essentially this multi-decadal period where you have a clean system and a legacy system. Both are too big not to infringe upon each other, but both are also too small to actually cover all of our energy needs. Just some examples of that I think we're already starting to see are things like, the clean system actually having to adapt to the fact that it's integrating into an existing system. So we see things like solar curtailment when we have large baseload plants that have a hard time ramping up and down. Similarly, we may see infringement on the fossil system from some of the intermittent renewables in terms of forcing gas plants to ramp more than they do, those types of things. But ultimately, I think during this mid-transition period, we really do need to pay quite a lot of attention to the fact that there are potentially maladaptations that emerge that basically just arise from the point that this is a harder situation than either a stable starting point of the legacy system or the stable end point of the fully clean system. So all of these points kind of lead to the overall question of how do we actually facilitate a normative transition that is both decarbonized and just, and specifically thinking a lot about what it looks like to safely and effectively close things without really harming the communities that have hosted them, while also building out new things, also paying attention to not harming the communities that host them. Just to give a little bit of a sense of what this looks like in the electricity sector specifically, this is some work that I did a couple of years ago, and so you may see some plants on here that have a different status than they did in 2018, but essentially the point of this map, and this is actually an interactive map, if you ever want to go play with it, the link is at the bottom, and you can kind of step through year by year, but what this is showing is all of the fossil-fired power plants in the United States that were operational as of 2018. I think the point that I like to make with this image is basically that this is a huge amount of infrastructure. It's critically important to handling all of the electricity needs that we have. And it's also an amount of infrastructure that's not really compatible with a deep decarbonized future. And so thinking very carefully about what it looks like to really actually transition that infrastructure in a way that lines up very specifically with what is coming, but also allows us to maintain what we need to be able to do in terms of service provision is difficult. This is, I think, an overall call to plan this and to think very, very carefully, not just about kind of the broader points about climate change, jobs, those types of things, but also very specifically at an individual asset level. What do we know about this asset? What do we know about this workforce? And how do we need to manage that over the next several decades in order to make this smooth? So I will stop there and turn it back to Hannah. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Gerbert. We're going to go ahead next with Stephen Bennett from PJM to talk about the grid operator's perspective of this mid-energy transition.
Yeah, thank you. Just a real quick sound check. Hannah, thumbs up if you can hear me. Great, thanks very much. Can we move to the next slide? And yeah, hi. So thank you to the agency for inviting me to participate in the last Power Hour of this season of the year. My name is Stephen Bennett. I'm a manager of regulatory and legislative affairs for PJM. PJM is a regional transmission organization, or RTO, that serves all or part of 13 states and the District of Columbia. And you can see here from the map that PJM encompasses a very large portion of the Mid-Atlantic region of the United States, and our service territory spans as far westward as Northern Illinois. PJM's focus on cost-effective, reliable electric service is sharpened by the recognition that 65 million people, generating about a fifth of US economic production, depend on us to keep the lights on a daily basis. Next slide, please. Recently, PJM's leadership undertook a strategic refresh effort to make sure that PJM's strategic vision was aligned with the challenges and opportunities that we're seeing in the industry today. As you can see from this slide, we developed three what we call strategic pillars, and they rest on a foundation of reliability. And that's important to PJM because our primary mission is cost-effective reliability. So everything we do rests on that foundation. These strategic pillars, facilitating decarbonization, grid of the future, and innovation, were the results of that effort. Now, PJM is not a policy-making entity. We cannot make or promulgate decarbonization policies, but what we can do is work with our stakeholders and our state policymaker partners to try to find ways for PJM to be a trusted, independent, non-biased policy advisor. And we also look for ways that we can leverage PJM's platforms of markets, operations, and transmission planning to help facilitate and move those decarbonization policies forward. PJM's grid is changing, it's evolving. The grid of the future, in a sense, is here now. And the grid is evolving to meet not just the decarbonization and clean energy transition needs, but also needs of new and innovative technologies, both on the generation and the load side. And it's evolving to meet the needs and requirements of changing customer behavior. So we're seeing customers make choices in electrification, in transportation, that are also driving the needed changes in our grid. And in a sense, innovation underpins all of those things that I just mentioned. So PJM needs to work both, again, internally and externally to understand the implications of these changes in technologies and to make sure that PJM has the appropriate mindset and skill set to meet these challenges and opportunities as we move forward. Next slide, please. So as the RTO, PJM is undertaking a number of different studies to better understand, both for ourselves and for our stakeholders, all of these implications. So as we evolve the grid, as we move through the clean energy transition, there are going to be a lot of implications. And so we have a number of studies in progress in order to try to better understand those things. In this particular case, I want to talk a little bit about our energy transition study, which is in its second phase. And this study, driven by PJM strategic pillars, we've embarked on a multi-phase, multi-year effort to study the potential impacts associated with the evolving resource mix. The diverse set of state policies across PJM were synthesized into 3 scenarios: base, policy, and accelerated. And those scenarios basically have different amounts of carbon-free generation and energy on the system. And as you can see, base is 40% carbon-free, policy is 50% carbon-free, and accelerated is 70% carbon-free. And we refined and extended those scenarios in order to look at the impacts of 4 major sensitivities: electrification, energy storage, interregional interchange on our transmission system, and the inclusion of a downward sloping operating reserve demand curve, which I won't get into too much in this discussion, but we have a lot of information on that on the PJM website. The study does not propose solutions. Rather, the intent is to understand the impact of renewables in a PJM context, identify tipping points, and to inform and initiate discussion on changes that may be required given these industry trends. Next slide, please. So this slide just indicates some of the assumptions, inputs, and sensitivities associated with that accelerated scenario case. You can see the amount of wind and solar that is included here. And there's some significant amounts of storage, both standalone and in a solar hybrid construct, as well as a significant amount of electrification, both in the transportation and building, primarily heating sectors as well. Next slide, please. There were a number of key findings and observations that came out of the second phase of our transition study. And the one I'd like to focus on here is that first one, talking about the shift that we see in seasonal resource adequacy due to electrification. Electrification reinforces the need for an adequate supply of thermal resources to meet the winter demand until a different technology can be identified that provides a capacity substitute at scale. Traditionally, in PJM, resource adequacy risk has been concentrated in the summer. Even in the accelerated scenario without electrification, we see 95% of the load loss risk in the summer season. However, electrification, when introduced as a sensitivity, in particular heating, has an asymmetrical impact, with the demand growth in winter more than doubling that of what we see in the summer. Consequently, there is a pronounced shift in both the seasonal and hourly risk profiles, forcing a new seasonal split of 20% load loss risk in the summer and 80% in the winter. And here's just an example of where we're seeing the changes in our grid, the clean energy transition, electrification, creating what could be a very significant change in the way PJM addresses our system and our load loss risk. The additional focus areas and observations here have a lot to do actually with that shift from summer to winter. The load curves in PJM look different in summer and winter. In summer, you have a one kind of taller peak period in the afternoon. And in the winter, you have two smaller but wider peak periods, one in the morning and one in the late afternoon or evening. And what this study has shown is that there are changes and things that PJM will need to do to manage a shift from summer to winter load loss risk. Flexibility, need to support ramping, storage becomes very important. Customer behavior becomes very important, because one of the notable aspects of the winter demand curve is that those peak periods, oftentimes the morning period occurs before the sun rises, and the evening period occurs after the sun sets. And one of the things that our system is seeing is an increase in solar generation, both on the system and in our interconnection queue. So we're seeing solar increase on the system, and we're also seeing a desire to add more solar resources in the future. Unfortunately, if these peak periods occur when the sun isn't shining, then the solar, these additions of solar generation aren't as helpful in meeting those peak needs. So we're seeing things like storage and a solar hybrid storage be very effective in increasing the solar capability to meet those peak periods. And retail rate design and customer that incentivizes customer behavior to move, especially electric vehicle charging outside of those peak periods, is going to be really important going forward as well. Next slide, please. As with most of our studies right now, as we're looking at the ongoing clean energy transition, the integration study is a living study. It's evergreen. It's meant to continue moving forward as the clean energy transition moves forward. And this living study continues to represent PJM's tangible efforts to identify opportunities in the current market construct and offer insights into the future of market design, transmission planning, and system operations. The findings in this study should not be regarded as expected outcomes, but as guideposts that will be refined as the study progresses. With that in mind, PJM will be undertaking another set of assumptions and sensitivities as we move to phase 3. There'll be a policy update to make sure that the study encompasses the very latest in laws and rules and regulations across our footprint. So we see our states changing and making a lot of their clean energy transition goals more ambitious. We'll have a retirement sensitivity. We are seeing an increase in the amount of policy-driven generation retirements. And you can see that in the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act that has a whole section that's dedicated to the phase out of fossil fuel resources over time. We'll have interchange sensitivities where we'll look at renewable build out across the entire Eastern Interconnect to understand how that PJM interacts with our neighboring systems. And we'll have a 100% carbon-free scenario that we'll model as a sensitivity as well. Next slide. Another study that PJM is undertaking, we call our Grid of the Future study. So we've released a report on that study that outlines a vision for the grid of the future, and it's informed by key industry trends and drivers that could impact our transmission system and our transmission planning system. The report envisions a transmission system driven by decarbonization, renewables, public policy, and a diverse resource mix with new technologies. The goal of the study is to ensure that the future grid maintains the reliability and operational flexibility necessary to address key drivers that are changing the face of the industry. It builds on the work of other studies like our transition study and our offshore wind study, and is informed by reviews completed by other RTOs and other entities. And as you can see, the grid has a number of challenges and opportunities. We're seeing offshore wind development on the East Coast. We're seeing increases in RPS, increases in storage and solar, distributed energy resources. And we're doing this in a period where our transmission owners are refreshing some of their aging infrastructure. And unfortunately, as we were recently reminded, we need to be constantly vigilant on resilience and critical infrastructure protection. Next slide, please. So that's basically the end of my comments. I always like to put a little plug in for PJM's PJM Now app. It's a great way for people to track different aspects of PJM, including electricity use, fuel mix, prices, conditions, emergency scenarios, and things of that nature. So if you have a chance, go ahead and download that app and you can track what's going on in PJM. Again, I want to thank the agency for inviting me to participate, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks very much.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final Power Hour of the year. My name is Hannah McCory. I'm a graduate fellow here at the IPA. And today I'll be talking about the IPA's role in the energy transition and what we're doing for the state of Illinois. Next slide, please. So what is the state of Illinois doing? Through legislation passed last year, the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, or Sija, in Illinois, we're really focusing on an equitable transition for all residents within Illinois, and we're also trying to ensure that communities that have been traditionally left out of the clean energy transition have an opportunity to participate. Here at the IPA, through Sija, we have increased funding for our solar programs that we have here. Our Solar for All program, which is funded both by the Renewable Energy Resource Fund and utility funding, has increased, almost tripled in the past year. So that way we can, our Solar for All program is an income eligible program. So that helps people who traditionally cannot afford rooftop solar or any other types of solar. We also have our Illinois Shines program, also known as the Adjustable Block program. We have increased the project categories for that program. We have public schools, community-driven community solar, and equity-eligible contractors. This gives people more access and ability to subscribe to solar, which traditionally they've been left out of. Next slide, please. Under Sija, we also have increased funding for our RPS budget to help continue the decarbonization efforts throughout the state. We also expand funding to other types of clean energy projects through utility scale development, as well as brownfield solar development and coal to solar. Through Sija, there is also an increase in ZEC and CMC credit payments to help our current clean energy fleet of mostly nuclear plants continue on. Through Fija, back in 2017, we had our Zero Emission Standard Plan, or ZECs, and that helped at-risk nuclear plants stay online and continue to give us clean energy here in Illinois. And then the carbon mitigation credit programs, which came out of Sija, can help continually support our nuclear fleet, as well as ensure that they stay online for the future as we reach 2050 zero emissions. Next slide, please. So our RPS goals and targets in Illinois have been updated through Sija legislation. The Sija requires that 40% of energy consumption in the state will come from renewable energy by 2030. And then Illinois will, once they reach that goal, will push for 50% by 2040. This is calculated from REC procurements rather than specific generation from the state, as we want to ensure that there are all avenues to meet these RPS goals. And then additionally, we have specific RPS targets that are energy technology specific. So we want 45% to come from wind, 55% from solar. Traditionally, Illinois' previous RPS goals and targets much more heavily favored wind development, and now we've kind of balanced that out to encourage solar development. Illinois also has a goal to procure over 45 million RECs annually by 2030. Next slide, please. Our current Illinois generation mix is already pretty clean. We have lots of carbon-free nuclear energy that supports our baseload generation. Over 50% of our state's electricity net generation comes from nuclear, and we want to ensure that that stays on the grid as we go through that clean energy transition. Renewable energy accounted for just almost 12% of in-state electricity generation last year. Our carbon mitigation credit programs and ZEC standards will help keep the nuclear fleet online as our fossil fuel fleets go offline and the renewables come online. This also helps us meet clean energy goals, because clean energy just doesn't mean renewables, it means using the existing technology that we already have. Next slide, please. Beyond what we do here at the IPA, there are other state initiatives to help through Sija. So our friends over at the Illinois Commerce Commission right now are working on the Renewable Energy Access Plan, which outlines the pathway to help meet our clean energy goals and the decarbonization efforts that we have to do across the entire state, not just what we do here at the IPA. Sija also had a lot of carve-outs for EV rebates, because across the country you see not just Illinois, but the transportation sector is one of the most carbon intensive sectors that we have. So helping decarbonize that with making it more affordable to switch to electric vehicles is great for our residents. There's also a charging incentive program to help build out a charging station network in this state, which will help ensure that if you do switch to an EV, you have a place to charge it when you're out on the roads. All right, next slide, please. And that's my presentation. So I'm going to turn it over to Scott Vaught at ComEd.
Thank you, Hannah, and appreciate the invite from you and the IPA for the Power Hour. And based on what a lot of folks have already heard through the presentations, we're going to be talking similarly about a similar study that Stephen just talked about at PJM, but we have focused ours on Illinois in particular and our service territory in terms of what we need to do or what we see happening to the grid in order to achieve net zero by 2050. So if you can go ahead and go to the next slide. Go one more. And we hired E3, who's doing a lot of these studies across the country, and in particular for our company in a lot of different service territories. And we had them evaluate what does the grid look like, or what does the grid need to look like in order for us to achieve the U.S. Climate Alliance target that Illinois has signed on to by 2050, which is really a net zero economy-wide decarbonization by 2050. And where we started was with a scenario that just says, how far do we get with Sija? And when you couple onto that, the IRA that was passed this August, how far do we get and where do we need to go? And what does that mean in terms of grid resiliency and reliability as we move forward? So if you can go to the next slide.
Scott, I think you have glitched for a minute. Do you mind repeating what you just said?
The gas plants by 2045 get you to about 42%. But in order to actually achieve the Climate Alliance targets, we have a significant additional decrease in carbon that we need to achieve in order to hit those targets. And we need additional policy, frankly, to drive that pathway as we go forward. So if you go to the next slide. This is a illustration of where the sources of carbon are in the state of Illinois. And one of the interesting things as we were going through this study with E3, which was a significant learning for me, is the amount, and it's probably not surprising, but the amount of agriculture driven carbon emissions that we have in the state. But as we started to go through it, right now, there's a significant lack of technology or technology options on how to deal with those carbon emissions in agriculture. So it's going to be tough for Illinois to get there. So we're going to have to overachieve in some other areas in order to offset it. So as you move through time, based on current policy, you can see we make significant reductions to decarbonization in the generation sector, and moderate reductions in the transportation sector based on the policies that Hannah just went through. But we need significant more policy in order to address these other sectors of the economy in order to get to net zero. So if you can go to the next slide. And as Stephen said and had indicated, when we start to look at what are the technologies and scenarios that lead to net zero, we ran basically two scenarios. One was a moderate what we call moderate electrification, which is really significant electrification, and high electrification. And it really goes to where Stephen was talking about around home heating. And if you think about the coldest days in Chicago in particular, where you might get to -20 or -30, a heat pump or a cold climate heat pump can close the gap from probably -10 degrees up to 70. But what do you do for those other 10 to 20 degrees on those coldest days? And the difference in the scenarios really is whether you have gas backup heating or you have electric backup heating. And the scenario in the high electrification has significantly more electric backup heating than the moderate one. But the key result from here is in order to achieve net zero by 2050 in these two scenarios, you can see the significant amount of load that we would expect to add to the system by electrifying the heating sector, almost doubling the amount of sales that we would have under the base case scenario in 2050 of 127 terawatt hours. And keep in mind today, we're at about 87 terawatt hours on our system right now. So that's a significant amount of growth to 228 by 2050. And as Stephen said, the amount of peak demand that we see on the system grows significantly from where we are today, which is around 20 gigawatts on the system, all the way up to 48 gigawatts under the high electrification scenario, or 37 under the moderate scenario. But the switch from summer to winter peak is just something that even as I've been in this with this company for 24 years, it's hard to wrap my head around, frankly, but it does make sense. It's not something that we have been used to planning for. And these are the things that we are studying and evaluating and trying to determine, okay, what does that mean for us in terms of what do we need to do the grid? How do we need to design the grid differently? And what does it mean for resource adequacy to get to this point? So if you go to the next slide. When we run these cases, we've been evaluating the generation stack in particular, very similarly to what PJM has been doing. The stack on the left, the reference case, is what we think comes online based on Sija and the IRA in terms of generation plant. We go up to about 50 gigawatts of installed capacity versus where we are today, which is very close to 30 gigawatts of installed capacity, but the coal and the gas goes away per Sija, and it gets replaced with a significant amount of renewables, largely utility scale solar, and a significant increase in distributed generation solar driven largely by the RPS and IRA. And you start to see increased wind, and you start to see hydrogen pop into the mix. And then if you go over to the moderate electrification cases, you can see that number, the amount of generation, clean renewable generation that you need in order to meet the peaks and the level of demand that we just showed on the prior page grows very, so significantly up to about 125 terawatt hour or gigawatts of installed capacity versus where we are today. So if you think about that, that's a 5-fold increase in the amount of generation. And this is our service territory and not the state. So when we did this both at the state and the service territory level. And we do have that analysis, and I should have said this at the very beginning, I apologize. On Tuesday at 9 a.m., E3, the study that we commissioned E3 to do and worked on with several of the stakeholders in Illinois will be made public and available for everyone to read. And that'll be available on E3's website, I believe at 9 a.m. on Tuesday morning. So if you go to the next slide, this is a breakdown of what we see as the peak demand, the end uses or the end sources of that customers are using that drives that peak demand. So on the left, you can see under the reference case, in 2022, about half of our peak demand is driven by cooling in the summer. In the reference case, we would still be at a summer peaking utility. But to the extent we want to get to net zero, we switch into that winter, into that February, January peaking time frame. And we replace that cooling load with significant amounts of heating load. And the candlesticks at the top illustrate, when we're evaluating the peak demand effects, we're looking at what we consider normal weather. And in this instance, in 2050, we have done another study with Argonne looking at what happens to climate change and what happens to weather normal conditions over this period of time. And in 2050, we expect to be warmer, and we have reflected those warmer temperatures. But even to the extent that you have a 1 in 10 cold snap, you can see how many additional gigawatts of capacity you add, and that's from the backup heating that you need to close the gap on those absolute coldest days. This slide is sort of daunting to us as we look at it. In some aspects, 2050 seems very far off, but when you're talking about a grid that has average useful life of assets of 40 to 50 years, this is not so far away as we think about planning the grid. And this is, as we think about climate change and the critical need to address climate change as soon as possible, we need to start thinking about how we transition the grid to be able to meet these load demands soon. If you can go to the next slide. So this is the cost estimate. And as we have, and based on the paper that will be released on Tuesday, we're gonna break this down even more. But the top axis is really those incremental costs for not only electricity investment, but also customer investments into technologies, whether it's electric vehicles, the cost differential there, or whether it's the cost differential between a heat pump and a natural gas furnace. And those are net of incentives provided by the IRA and Sija. But when you look at these incremental costs, the analysis suggests under the moderate scenario case, you're adding about $28 billion of incremental cost in 2050. That's an annual cost increase. But you're going to avoid about $12 billion of fossil generation driven costs. And you also avoid the societal cost of carbon, which gets you close to a net cost.
Hi, Scott. It looks like there's been a bit of an interruption with your connection here. We'll give it a second to see if it comes back.
Avoided cost related to health benefits from having an air quality improvement. So what is the cost of air pollution directly on the residents of Illinois? And we do have those numbers now baked into the study, and that's going to result in a net benefit across the board. So if you go to the, did you guys lose me? Oh, there we go. All right. So one of the big takeaways right at the top as we look at this, as while the Sija and IRA support high levels of electric transportation and electric and transportation sector decarbonization, we're going to need significantly more than is incentivized currently under Sija and the IRA in order to meet the demand in a net zero world. Additionally, storage resources, as Stephen was indicating, shifting to a February peak and a peak time of about 4 a.m. to 8 a.m. as people are getting up and homes are getting warmer, is not going to align well with the amount of solar generation available at those times of days, especially if you think about Chicago and how dark and depressing February can be around here. So we need significant amounts of batteries and hydrogen and non-intermittent load in order to support those peaks. We need new policies, which really aren't on the books right now, to drive electrification of buildings, heavy duty transportation, industry and agriculture, and grid investment. As we look at those winter peaks and the amount of deliveries on this system, which we see is doubling by 2050, we need to think about how to transition the grid to support that as we go forward. And affordability and cost, just as we walk through the numbers. In the near term, decarbonization could reduce customer energy costs if IRA funding is leveraged, but over the longer term, we're looking at significant cost pressures. So we need to be mindful of the policies. And as Sija tries to do that, we need to make sure that those who can least afford to transition probably transition sooner rather than later, so that they can take advantage of the incentives that are available through IRA and Sija. We need to be mindful of how those societal benefits and where those societal benefits accrue to individual communities. And with that, that is my very fast run through of a very long study. And I invite you all to download the study on Tuesday morning and dive into it at your own leisure. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present.
Thanks very much, Scott. We've had a number of questions come in through the chat, and they've been addressed by our presenters who have been on top of it. Looks like we might have a couple more here. Let me take a look. We have a question from Scott Dubois. ComEd DG rebate, looking for funds for your solar and or storage project. See our ComEd website. Okay, we have that one. Another one from Ann McCabe. Ann asks, what assumptions did E3 make about heat pump adoption?
It's about, it depends on the scenario, Ann. So in order to get to decarbonization, they had assumed for the most part that you replace over time as furnaces come up to their end lives. And they did an inventory analysis of what the embedded useful life of heating equipment was in the state, and kind of modeled out what the retirement dates would look like. And in essence, when they get to 2035, they're assuming every new heating furnace is replaced with a heat pump. It's a question of whether the heat pump has gas as a backup source, or a gas furnace as a backup source, or if it has electric baseboard as the backup source. But I would suggest that in that report, it's going to break down the details for you to get you to the specific numbers.
Thank you again, Scott. Wanted to give one more chance to anyone who has questions. You're welcome to participate. We'll give it a minute, and then if not, we will hear some remarks from Illinois Power Agency Acting Director Brian Granahan. We have a question here from David Loomis to Hannah. Are there any programs that the IPA that are oversubscribed?
Currently, there are some categories within our Illinois Shines program that have met capacity for the program year, and we're waiting for the next block to open up. Going forward, we anticipate that there will be more interest. And then in our last procurement event for utility scale, there were still capacity that was left unfilled, especially in the wind category.
Thank you for your question, and just giving it another second to see if any more come in. Yes, and we're going to unmute for a question here. Let me just find you here, Sarah.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. I had a question as well on the E3 study with, I think it was ComEd, on the electrification and on kind of energy transition. You said that you assumed that those systems would not be replaced until they had ended their useful life. But I know that there are also a lot of incentives and a lot of like programs that are trying to encourage people to transition faster. So I'm just wondering if there were any scenarios in those studies that made those timeline assumptions more based on policies and incentives available rather than on the actual like date that the existing stock would no longer be useful.
My understanding is no. We didn't. That was one of the things we had considered, whether we had pushed forward the adoption, because I agree with you, those incentives do make them highly cost effective right now. But I think from our perspective and E3's perspective, it's really hard to push a replacement of a furnace and a heating system ahead of the end of its useful life, just given the market dynamics of how people start to do that in investigation and decision making. Not that to say it won't happen, but we didn't want to make that as the default assumption. So and it really kind of points you to different policies, because it's the same around EVs to a large degree, right? Is that customers tend to make that decision. Cars are a little different, I guess, because people can replace cars a little quicker. But even in that instance, to the extent that they are cost beneficial, that decision-making process, how much does it get accelerated from what that normal decision-making process is? Driving predilection of adoption was a tough one for us to kind of overcome and accelerate. We look at state policies in particular around, like we've seen in California and Michigan and other things, where requiring the sales of new vehicles by a certain year to be either an EV or to require the replacement of a gas furnace with a heat pump as being sort of critical path kind of things. And the model kind of landed it. In order to get to net zero, you need that timeline to happen right around 2030 or 2035 in order to make the numbers work.
Thanks again. And then if there are no more questions, I'll hand the floor over to Brian Granahan.
There we go. Can you hear me? Good.
Yes.
Thumbs up. All right, perfect. Well, thank you, Brian, and thanks to all of our speakers today. I've got just some brief notes of things to discuss very quickly. Thanks to everyone for, I think, a successful 2022 with the Power Hour series, our speakers today, our speakers across the year, all of our attendees, and then lastly to Mega and Brian and the communications team at the IPA for putting this series together. The goal of the Power Hour series has always been about education. It's been an educational series on topics of interest that bear connection to the IPA's work. I think we recognized back in 2021 that there's a lot of things the IPA does that are a lot of interest externally or have a lot of impacts on everyday citizens, but they're really arcane and technical. So this series is a way for us to try to distill down some of those highly technical pieces into something that's ideally more accessible. You know, ultimately, for our agency, we're a public body providing public services. So I think that connects back to how we can better serve the public by providing a forum like this. So the Power Hour series is for a more general audience than, say, our webinars and workshops. Those tend to be about discrete program and procurement requirements. They can be very technical in nature. They can be about interpretation of certain phrases. I always think about the Power Hour, the intended audience being legislators and the media. That's probably not the actual audience, but it's the way in which we want to present, the level on which we want to present, that level of sophistication and understanding. So it's probably not people who track what we're doing daily or even weekly, but who vaguely know what the IPA is trying to accomplish. So I'm laying out this background to give a sense for what this looks like going forward. Back in 2021, the Power Hour series was really just about Sija implementation. We were trying to distill down a large and complex bill for a more general audience. Presentations were almost exclusively made by IPA staff members. They were around different distinct parts of the bill that we had to do some work on. So it kind of lent itself to us having 7 or 8 different webinars where we basically talked about, well, the IPA has to do this, and we have IPA speakers. In 2022, we started fanning out to talk about other public policy issues that connect back to the IPA's work. And we've become more reliant on outside speakers and experts, with IPA staff playing a role. And I think that's an important thing. I think we want to, as an agency, continue to broaden out, get more perspectives, and hear from more people. So then the question is, what does the Power Hour series look like in 2023? And I think you can ask some of the same questions of the IPA. What does the IPA look like going forward? And I think as an agency, we do need to think a bit more expansively and proactively. That means taking a broader view of challenges and barriers and opportunities. It means serving as more of a forum and platform that can cut across agencies or cut across various sectors, nonprofits, government, private sector entities, and work collaboratively with all stakeholders to achieve objectives, and thinking about objectives and not merely prescriptive mandates. And part of the reason for that is, even if the outcome you're looking from is meeting a mandate, like an RPS target, sometimes you can't actually meet that mandate by only doing what's prescriptively required. So I think today's Power Hour is a good example of that. There's a lot of items that we discussed that might not be part of the IPA's direct jurisdictional oversight, but you can't really think about the IPA's work in, say, facilitating the development of initial renewable energy generation without also having an eye on the distribution system, the transmission grid, decarbonization, and other sectors, and other things that play in the space of that objective. So for the Power Hour series in 2023, I think we want to have a broader and more expansive focus as well. I think we want to focus more on items like equity, on emerging technologies, on federal funding opportunities, and broader public policy concerns, and then also look to other states and jurisdictions and try to engage in more comparative analysis. Ideally, people will then look to the IPA as an agency with potential solutions to emerging challenges in the energy space. And ideally, we'll look at the Power Hour series as one of many platforms provided by the IPA for having those discussions. So we'll be back with another Power Hour in February of 2023, and we're in the process right now of putting together an agenda of topics for the coming year. In the meantime, if you have any ideas for Power Hour topics, given that background and given that focus, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Mega. I think we want to make this series as productive as possible and as useful as possible. And so ideally, we're able to crowdsource some ideas about other things that people see that they want us to address. So with that, I really want to thank everybody for attending not just this Power Hour, but also all the Power Hours we've had across the year. Again, any ideas from you are welcome. And thank you so much for your time. Everybody, thanks.
Thank you.